Chapter 15. Blaine's mind was a confusing swirl of contradictory and maddeningly incongruous thoughts. He liked Melody. He really did. He liked spending time with her. He trusted her like he'd never trusted anyone. And yet, where exactly was that trust leading? She obviously had assumptions about its trajectory, but those assumptions scared him to death. There was the whole question of her schooling. In one way, he understood, and he was vaguely grateful somewhere deep, deep down, below the fear of what she might expect in return. And on top of everything, there was the question of what to do or say about the pills. He saw clearly now both her desire to lose weight and what it was doing to her. True, to him it was great to be thin, but thin in and of itself wasn't the point. The point was to be healthy, and she wasn't. How she wasn't freaked out by the loss of hair and occasional unsteadiness, which he had also witnessed but not wholly understood until now, was beyond him. And then there were the headaches Dylan had mentioned, but Blaine had never really assigned importance to until now. However, was it his place to say anything about her life? That she wanted them to become more than friends was abundantly clear. What wasn't as clear was how close he wanted to get to finding out what happened after that. On Friday, he dropped Dylan off with very little conversation. He couldn't even look at her. Confusion reigned everything in him, every thought, every breath. By some ability other than his own, he made it to work, but the truth was, he was a stressed-out mess. Melody was tired, but not that tired. She knew a brush-off when she saw one, and nothing about his actions spoke of the two of them going any further than they had. Sure, he'd said something along those lines on a couple of occasions, but it was clear some other part of him was in control at those times. Once again, she was stuck where she always ended up eventually, alone and confused. She stepped on the scales in the bathroom. Drinking water like a sieve, she was constantly having to take pit stops. One look at the numbers and she growled low and menacingly. How was it possible to gain 2 pounds in one stinking day? It wasn't like she'd scarfed down a whole steak and a plate of potato salad, but was one little bite asking too much? Frustrated, she stepped off and swiped off the light. That was just about her luck these days. Fat, ugly, friendless, and alone. Yep, that was about the extent of her life. "Oh, you're here," Blaine said when Eve walked in the break room at just after 4. "You eat out for lunch?" "Something like that." She swiped at the cups of coffee and knocked them over, scattering them across the tiles. Crud. She put her hand to her forehead, beating back the pain that was etched all over her being. Frustration emanated out of her as she bent and yanked the cups from the floor. "Hey." Blaine stood, swiped the cups up, and stacked several on the little cabinet. Then he stopped to look at her. "What's wrong?" Somehow, in all of his own concerns, he'd forgotten all about hers. Why Melody would want to be more than friends with him when he wasn't even all that great at the friends thing was more than he could explain. Still, he reached out to Eve gently. "Hey." She was crying now. Her head was down, her body quaking silently. "Hey, no, don't cry." He pulled her into his embrace. "Shh." He couldn't help but think how much smaller and fragile she felt than Melody. It was as if they were the antithesis of each other. Moments passed during which he searched through his mental files of what to do in such situations. However, he came up empty. "I'm sorry." She pulled out of his arms and grabbed 3 napkins for tissue. "I thought I could do this." True worry crashed over him. Do what? "This." Throwing her hands out to the side, she looked around the break room. "Work. Live." She blew her nose long and loud. Now she was really scaring him. "Whoa, Eve, where's this coming from?" He led her to the table. "Here, sit down. You want some water?" At the table, she nodded pathetically, and he jumped into action. Although he'd always thought the hero cool, he knew with equal veracity that he could never fill the role. However, today, for this one moment, he stopped thinking about the right moves or the cool moves and just did it. In seconds, he was sitting down, pushing the water over to her. That's when he remembered the absence of the silver SUV the day before. "Are you still not feeling well?" he asked, staring at her, trying to figure out what was going on. She glanced at him. "Depends. Physically or emotionally?" "Both." A moment, and then horror enveloped him as he watched her crumble into the tears again. Not knowing what else in the world he could do, he reached over to her. She leaned toward him and let him hold her again. She seemed incapable of fighting it. "Eve, come on, girl, you're scaring me. Say something. Talk to me." Quiet sobs gripped her, and Blaine simply held her, not knowing what else to do. After a few minutes, she pulled herself together again and sat back. Her gaze was only on her water. She dragged in a breath and sniffed back the tears that still shimmered on her lashes. "We went to the doctor today. They don't think we can have children without help." Blaine's hand rubbed up and down her back. "Then you get help." She shook her head slowly, sadly. "It's not that easy. It's really expensive, and insurance won't cover all of it." He fought against the dwindling of her options. What about adoption? The anguish washing her face made him wish he hadn't asked. "I don't know. I wanted this so bad, and now—" The words trailed off. It was something he'd known since his parents split. There are moments that being an adult really and totally stinks. What do you say? Are there words? If there were, he didn't know them. "How's AJ?" She shook her head. "Devastated. He's on call tonight, so I probably won't see him until tomorrow at least." Her fist came down hard on the table, making it jump. "This is so unfair. He would be such a great dad. Why would God do this to us?" The quaking of her faith shook his own to the very core. He was so new to all of this having faith and trusting stuff, he had no idea what to say to her, much less what to say to himself. "God, help. I'm out of my league here." "Is that why you all left yesterday?" It was like someone had hit the pause button. She sat staring straight ahead, and he knew both the answers and that he shouldn't have asked. "It's so hard, seeing them like that," Eve said like a hollowed-out zombie. "I go, and I want to be happy for them, you know. But there's Alex and Lisa playing together, and I just can't help but think, why not me, God? Why her and not me? I know that's selfish, but it's how I feel." His heart hurt watching her struggle so hard. "I don't think that's selfish. I think you'd have to be the Tin Man not to feel something." He rummaged through his brain, trying to find something comforting to say. It was like looking for hope in a pit of hell's flames. "You know, I don't know why God does stuff. I don't. I've been asking why about my parents' divorce for a lot of years, and I still don't have any answers. Sometimes I think knowing why would make a difference, and sometimes I know it really doesn't matter. They made their choices, and life followed. I can't explain it, but that colored me in ways I can't even explain. I want a family, but I don't. I want someone right here with me, and I don't. I don't know if the family thing or even the girlfriend thing will ever even happen for me, if I can ever have the guts to let it. Sometimes I think that's a good thing. Sometimes it scares me to death." He snorted and ran his thumb down the bridge of his nose. "I'm rambling." He dragged in a breath and let it out slowly. "I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't have any answers for you, but I do have a shoulder if you need one. And my ears are starting to work pretty good, too." Her smile was still sad, but had taken on a grateful tinge when she looked up at him. She leaned over to him for a hug, and when he took her in his arms, he wanted with everything in him to make all things right in her world. "I'm sorry," he whispered softly. She nodded and sniffed. "I know." That he was preoccupied was abundantly obvious when Blaine showed up at 6:30. It was Friday, Normally they went out on Fridays. Tonight, he didn't look like burger material, and Melody didn't feel like going through the motions if he had already let go. What could she say that she hadn't already? "Monday?" he asked as Dylan headed for the front door. Melody nodded, following him all the way to the door. She wanted to ask, to talk about this, to get it all out in the open. But she was afraid if she asked the question, she might have to hear the answer, and it was an answer she never wanted to hear. His soft green shirt looked touchingly inviting, but she fought the urge. She'd already pushed too far, pressed too hard, said too much. If she just hadn't. A step down outside, and he turned to her. At that moment, there was no denying the soul-wrenching misery in his eyes. "Thanks, Mel." Her heart broke for him, for them. They were words she'd wanted him to say, but not like this, not with him walking down her sidewalk away from her. "You're welcome." For 1 second he paused, and then he turned and strode away with Dylan a half-step ahead of him. Halfway down the sidewalk, he replaced his sunglasses, and she felt the distance growing between them. At the car when he looked back up at her, it was the old Blaine, cool, calculating, and in control. As much as she didn't want it to, what she felt most was acceptance of how utterly impossible it was for them to ever be together. Even if he got his life on solid ground again, it was a sure bet he would find some svelte honey in slinky clothes and heels up to her neck. Melody closed the door and wished reality didn't have to hurt so much. When the phone rang at 9:30, Blaine had the absurd hope that it was her. It wouldn't be, not after the way he'd acted, but somehow the thought still went through his mind. "Hello?" "Dude, what'd you do, fall off the planet?" Peyton sounded mildly off-center, which, for 9:30 on a Friday night, could easily be called right on schedule. "We missed you at Daphne's party." Blaine pulled a chair over and sat down, trying to remember how long ago the party was. The truth was, he had no idea. "Yeah, I was kind of busy that night." "Kind of busy? That's code for you found a better party, right?" Something like that. There was so much to be thankful for in their friendship, but at the moment, Blaine couldn't help but feel how far apart they had grown. It wasn't just the money. It was the direction their lives were headed, and for the first time, he almost felt glad about that. "So, to what do I owe this phone call anyway?" "Oh, hey, dude, I got an offer on the Carrera." Yeah, Peyton was getting more tipsy by the moment. A wail of music from a set of speakers pierced through the conversation. Hey, Peyton yelled, so that Blaine had to pull the phone away from his ear to avoid getting his own eardrum blown. "Turn that thing down. Can't you see I'm on the phone?" He spat an expletive and then another for good measure, and then returned to the conversation. "Sorry, dude. What was I? Oh, yeah, the Carrera. I got an offer, but I told him I had to talk to you first." It was strange how at one time this conversation would have driven nails of horror into Blaine. Now it felt almost like releasing a bird from a cage. The opening of the cage took almost nothing. "Sell it. I'm not going to be needing it anymore." "Really? 'Cause I thought, awesome, dude. Did you get you some wheels other than that horrible bucket of bolts you had that one time?" There was no need to justify anything. "Thanks for letting me borrow it, Peyton," Blaine said, sensing this was the last conversation with this friend he would ever have. "But it's your car. You do whatever you want with it." Blaine took Dylan to Mrs. Rodriguez's on Saturday and Sunday. With classes not starting until Monday, he used the weekend to accumulate some much-needed hours. However, by Sunday night, when he got home at nearly 10, he was wiped out. Emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally. How he would ever face the start of 2 classes in the morning, he had no idea. He and Dylan walked into the house, which was terribly quiet and alarmingly dark. Blaine didn't like the sensations flowing through him at all. "Where's Mama?" Dylan asked, and his fear screamed like a banshee. "I thought she would be home." "Yeah, me too." Blaine made his way carefully into each and every room, reaching in to turn on the light first, preparing himself for what he might find. He'd always feared it would come down to her lying in a pool of blood, but he'd done his best to never let his head voice those thoughts, until now. Room by room, they made it all the way through the house to her bedroom. "Go get washed up for bed," Blaine instructed Dylan. "I don't think she's here." Dylan didn't look convinced, but he went to the bathroom anyway. When the water came on, Blaine closed his eyes, turned on the light, and praying the whole time, opened his eyes to examine the room. Nothing, not a thing out of place. It looked as stark and miserable as always. The breath of relief was barely there. Knowing he was being silly either because of exhaustion or mental overload, he stepped in and checked both the closet and behind the bed. Still nothing. The understanding that fear and fatigue were indeed getting the better of him went through him, and he shook his head at his own foolishness. Exhausted from everything, he met Dylan in the hallway and reached back and shut off the light. "You get on to bed. We've got to be on the road at 6. "'Kay," Dylan said. A breath of a second, then he all but dove into Blaine's arms. Not knowing what else to do, Blaine held him there. Could it be that Dylan was as scared as he himself was? "If he did something to get on your last nerve, would you still love him?" The words streaked into his consciousness, and he hugged the child extra tight. This couldn't be easy for him, and yet he was holding up remarkably well. Then suddenly, he let go, and without even looking at him, he headed for his room. "Good night." "Night," Blaine said, and watched his brother disappear into his room. Running his fingers through his hair, Blaine exhaled. Was it possible for everything to be a disaster, and yet be exactly as you thought you had wanted it forever? And why did it seem that there were suddenly far more questions in his life than answers? He tried to think that thought through, but it only made him even more tired. "God, you're going to have to take over tonight. I can't do it. I'm done." With that, he went to his room and was asleep in minutes. 2 full days of shoes, customers, and hassles had convinced Melody she did not want to be in retail. She'd always thought it was a place she could move up, a place of movers and shakers and action. But watching Farron and Nathan battle about who hadn't ordered the right style of boot made her seriously reconsider that notion. In the face of everything, did the right style of anything really matter that much? Did it bring smiles to the faces of those who shopped there? Not really. They still looked stressed and unhappy, even when they checked out and headed out the door. In fact, the more she really looked, the more miserable the majority of people looked. It was a strange revelation that others weren't as content as she had once believed them to be, and that for the most part, she had been far happier than any of them this summer. Being with Dylan felt for the first time in a long time like the right path for her. She was excited to get up in the morning, excited to plan what they would do, and she loved every minute of being with him. All weekend, the prospect of Monday was what she focused on to get through the tedium of shoe sales. On Monday morning when they showed up, she smiled for real at his arrival. "Hey, Buster." She gathered him from his brother's arms into her own. "I missed you." "We kind of had a late night last night," Blaine said, still not really looking at her as he dumped Dylan's things at the hallway entrance. "He might sleep a little while if you want to let him." "Oh, okay." And she saw it then, the misery and exhaustion in Blaine's eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in the eyes of so many customers over the weekend. "Do you start classes today?" He nodded, holding the breath in. 7:30 and 10. "And then you've got work?" "Until 7. Her own place in his life escaped from her consciousness, replaced by his position in hers. "You going to be able to handle this?" Surprise laced his eyes when he looked at her. "Yeah, I'll be fine." Melody knew the iron-hard quality of his determination and what that much determination could do to a fragile spirit. "Hey, be gentle with Blaine, okay? This little guy needs you in one piece." She tousled the little boy's hair as he pressed backward against her. An understanding smile came to Blaine's face. "Okay." He heaved a sigh. "Well, I'd better go." He turned for the door. Just as he got there, she couldn't help it. "Blaine?" He turned. "Yeah?" "Don't worry about us. We're good, okay?" For 1 second, the misery lifted from his eyes as he nodded. Then he opened the door and left. She took a breath and looked down at the boy. "You want to take a little nap on the couch?" "Yeah." He started in front of her to the couch. At the couch, he lay down as she got him comfortable. It wasn't long, and he was again asleep. Melody sat down in the chair across the way and watched him. He was such a cute kid. Many of his features reminded her so much of his big brothers. Worry coursed through her at the thought of Blaine. He was struggling. That much was clear. Her thoughts strayed to the times he'd talked about God and praying. Not that she really believed in all that stuff, but since he did, she figured it was worth a shot. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts go. "God, if you're up there, Blaine really needs you right now. He's got too much going on to handle it all himself. So if you could give him some help, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks." Blaine couldn't tell how much was real and how much was an act, and how much an act, but Eve seemed much better on Monday. He, however, was having heart issues of epic proportions. Melody had been so wonderful about everything, even his own idiocy in not knowing what he even wanted from their relationship. But what did that mean? That she was holding on, or that she had let go? And which did he want? It was a conundrum no matter which way he went. They needed to talk, but how to accomplish that was an even greater problem that he simply had no more brain cells to work on. "You look stressed," Eve said when she walked into the break room at 4. Blaine was hunched over his modern economics book, trying to make sense of anything written there. "Yeah, I wouldn't know why." He shook his head, realizing he should stop being so selfish and make sure she really was all right. Scooting a chair out, he waited for her to get her drink and sit. "How are you?" There was a smile. "Better. We talked about it, and we went to church on Sunday." She nodded. "Better." Then her gaze swung to his. "Thanks for last week." He shrugged. "Oh, you know." "I was a mess." "Not any more than usual," he said with a grin. She punched him. "I'm serious. You were there when I really needed someone. Thanks for that." He took in the compliment. "Hey, what are friends for, right?" Leaning back, she took a drink. "So, how are you and Melody? You looked pretty tight the other day at the lake." His gaze dropped like it fell off a cliff. Let's not even go there." With distress, her smile plummeted. "Oh, no." "Oh, yes." She looked even more concerned than he felt. What happened? There was no reason to lie. She knew too much. "Me. I'm the problem." He flipped the book shut with one swipe. "It's like I've got this button in me that starts screaming, 'Too close, too close, abort mission, every time we take a half step forward." Eve twisted her face into visible concern. "And Melody?" He looked for the answer and found nothing. "I don't know. She acts like nothing's wrong, but I know she's hurt. I just don't know how to quit hurting her with my stupid need to not get hurt myself. This is insane." "Have you tried being honest with her about how scared you are?" Blaine sat forward and scratched his ear. "Well, we haven't been out, just the two of us, in weeks and weeks. When we see each other, Dylan's always there." His gaze jumped to hers. Not that that's a bad thing, but it does make talking that much more difficult. The absence of answers stared him in the face. "I don't know. I give up. It's just too hard." Eve surveyed him slowly. "Funny, I never took you for a quitter." "Huh?" He looked at her, meeting the challenge of the words. She shrugged and took a drink. "I just never pegged you for someone who gave up when the going got tough. But I guess I don't know everything." Anger slashed through him, but he beat it back. "I'm not. Okay, I am on this, but come on. What else am I supposed to do?" "Talk to her? Tell her how you feel, not just some of it, but all of it. How stressed you are, How scared you are, all of it." "But what if she laughs in my face?" Eve leveled her gaze at him. "Blaine, do you really think she's going to laugh in your face?" The answer was quiet. No. Another protest rose in him. "But when are we going to have this conversation? When Dylan's sleeping in the back seat or in the booth at the burger place?" Her gaze fell. "Well, you could bring him over to our place. We could watch him." That thought sent him backward. "I couldn't ask you to do that, not after everything." Compassionate and peaceful, her gaze took him in. "You know, Friday I might have agreed with you, but now, who knows? Maybe God set this up for a reason." Blaine shook his head in honest awe. "You're something else, you know that?" Eve lifted the bottle to her lips. "So I've been told." The center of him was about to jump out of him and run as Blaine picked up Dylan later. He had no idea how he would ever explain this to her, but he had to ask. "And the math paper we did today is in his backpack. We ate Chinese, so the hamburger mac stuff is still in there too," Melody said, digging and remembering, but clearly not planning to actually look at him. As Blaine watched her, he let go of pushing her away. It wasn't hard to admit how grateful he was for everything she had done for him and for Dylan this summer. Giving only, expecting nothing in return, she was the embodiment of self-sacrificing love. He let out one more breath. "What are you doing Friday?" Her head jerked up so fast, he was sure it wobbled a little. "Friday? I don't know. Why?" "Well, I was thinking, we haven't had a proper date in a while." "Date?" Her eyes widened like saucers. "You mean you and me?" He leaned in. "Well, I like your mom and all, but I think she's a little old for me." Melody laughed, but still looked wholly skeptical. Well, nothing that I know of. What do you have in mind?" "Leave that up to me," he said, the mystery of the words making him wonder how he would pull off something great on his extremely limited budget of time and money. Deep concern slid across her features. "What about Dylan?" "I found a babysitter who's willing to watch him for a few hours." "Mrs. Rodriguez?" she asked with worry. "Because he said—" Blaine laughed. "It's not Mrs. Rodriguez. Come on, Mel, trust me for once. I promise you won't regret it." Looking like she'd just agreed to help him plunder the pyramids, she nodded. "Okay, but no funny business. Got it?" He held his hands up with another laugh. "No funny business." When Blaine and Dylan walked in on Wednesday night, the television was winking and blinking messages to the darkened house. Their mother hadn't been home for 5 days, and Blaine was beginning to wonder if they would ever see her again. However, when he got to the living room, all the nights of cleaning up after her came back with a snap. The sight pulled him down into the depths of anger and hurt. "Get on to bed," he said to Dylan, who stood on the threshold between the living room and kitchen, assessing the life wrecked in front of them. Bottles were everywhere, and there were needles on the end table. Blaine saw them almost reflexively. The sights and smells turned Blaine's stomach, which he remembered hadn't been fed in hours. However, even reeling, he sensed the child hadn't moved. He headed into the living room, trying to act unfazed. Over his shoulder as he picked up the bottles, he pulled up as much of his in-charge voice as possible. "I said, get to bed." "Is she dead?" The voice was high, scared, terror-laden. "No, just passed out." The fury over the whole situation and his mother came out toward Dylan. "Now get to bed. We have to leave early tomorrow." He brushed past Dylan and threw the bottles in the trash with a crash that jolted both him and Dylan, who stood there. "Are you sure she's not dead?" The tone of his voice was starting to remind Blaine of "I see dead people," and it was grating on his nerves. "She's not dead, okay? She's just being stupid again. Now get on to bed. I'm not going to tell you again." Carefully, he picked up 2 needles and carried them to the kitchen trash as well. Dylan's eyes widened. "What's that?" At the trash, Blaine's patience ran out. "Look at me. Are you in bed? No. I want you in bed now." Still looking both terrified and horrified, Dylan slid down the wall toward his room. Blaine closed his eyes and dragged in air. He hated this. With everything in him, he hated this. No kid deserved to grow up like this. As he strode into the living room again, he made a decision. They were getting out. He couldn't help her any more, and trying to was going to drag them all under. It wasn't what he wanted, but Dylan didn't need to be around broken bottles and needles and who knew what else. Tomorrow, he would start looking for a new place. When he walked by Dylan's bedroom after getting most of the living room clean, the door was cracked ever so slightly, and he heard the soft sobs. They snapped his heart right in two. Blaine looked up, trying to tell himself to just keep on walking. But he couldn't do that, not to the little boy who needed somebody so very much. Carefully, slowly, he pushed the door open. Huddled in the covers in the midst of darkness, the soft sobs filled the otherwise silent room. Blaine stepped over to the bed and sat down. "Hey, buddy." Instantly, the sobs stopped, replaced by sniffles. "I'm sorry. I'm going to sleep." His own harshness ripped through him. He reached over and rubbed his hand over the child's back. "I'm sorry I yelled at you before. I shouldn't have done that." The sniffs continued. I think something bad's going to happen." "No, hey, nothing bad's going to happen, okay? I won't let it." "But what if Dave comes back? What if he has a gun this time? What if he wants to kill us?" Until that moment, Blaine had no idea that the same nightmare scenarios running through his own mind were also running through his brother's. Somehow, he had hoped the child was too young to understand, but maybe he was just old enough to understand, but not old enough to have any control over the situation at all. "Hey, come here." And with that, Dylan was in his arms. "I'm scared, Blaine." "I know." Blaine nodded as he buried his face into the child's shoulder. "I know. I'm going to get us out of here, okay? I promise." The crash from the bathroom at 30:30 brought Blaine out of a deep, disturbing dream. He couldn't remember all of it, but enough was clear to make the crash jolt him upright, heart, body, and soul. Not really thinking clearly, he grabbed his glasses from the nightstand and the bat from next to the door. He opened the door, surveyed the situation, and stepped into the hallway where he found Dylan standing by his door. Dylan rubbed his eyes. "What was that?" "I don't know, but I'll take care of it. Just stay right there, okay?" Stepping to the bathroom door, Blaine could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his chest, squeezing out the breaths. At the bathroom door, he stopped. "Mom?" The moan was beyond weak. He pushed at the door and flipped on the light, revealing the horrific skeleton that had once been his mother. She was dressed only in a stained shirt and her underwear. For a second, the horror of her emaciated frame and slack face hanging over the toilet slithered through him. Lowering the bat, he stepped in carefully. Glass lay everywhere, scattered among the plastic bottles that were still in one piece, but were in a jumbled mess all over the floor. Red cough medicine dripped from the sink into a sickening pool to the floor. He inched his way in. "Mom, what happened?" And then she retched. How he kept his legs under him, Blaine would never know. What he did know in that moment was the flipping of the off switch in his mind to thinking about anything. The robot he had learned to rely on kicked into gear as he went about cleaning up the mess she was relentlessly making of everything. "I was trying to find some pills I had in there. Dave gave them to me," his mother said, wiping her mouth as Blaine picked up shards of dripping red glass. "Would you get them?" "Pills? Pills? Mom, the last thing you need is more pills from Dave." He picked up 3 large portions of the glass and dumped them into the trash. "No, it's not what you're thinking. It's not. Pills like aspirin pills." She was nodding off even as she said it. I wouldn't take drugs, Blaine. I wouldn't. I told you I wouldn't. Blaine snorted at her. Is that where you've been all week? Out shooting up with Dave? Are you going to bring him back here, Ma? Is that your plan? So we can all be one big, happy family again? No, Blaine, baby. She reached for him. It's not like that, I swear. He just wanted to talk about the divorce. You have to believe me. He dumped more trash into the garbage, and then, in all earnestness, he gave up. For 10 years, he'd been trying to clean up her messes, had been trying to make life good enough so she would want to live again. But all his efforts had been for naught. He hadn't saved her. He'd barely saved himself. However, at that moment, he vowed he would save Dylan. No more excuses, no more justifications. They were leaving. We're moving out, he said, standing there looking at her. If he could have helped her, he would have moved heaven and earth to do it. But he couldn't. She and only she could make that decision. As he stood there, he finally faced that fact. We'll be out by next week. Moving? Hollow eyes, filled with only emptiness, stared back at him. How? Why? You can't. He closed his eyes and gathered his courage. I love you, Mom. I do. But you don't love yourself, and I can't help you if you don't want help. Where you're going, I don't want to follow, and I can't let Dylan go down that road either. But, Blaine... She couldn't get the words out as tears pooled in her eyes. You're leaving? Yeah, Mom. We're leaving. They were the hardest words he'd ever spoken. We're moving. Dylan sat at the counter in Melody's house on Friday morning, eating the last of the eggs. They needed to go to get groceries later. She'd already started making the list in her mind. However, in 1 second, the list evaporated. Moving? What do you mean, moving? We're not going to live in our house anymore. He kept eating as if he wasn't setting off bombshells in her life and heart. Blaine says I'll have to go to a new school. His little eyes looked up at her. Do you think new schools are scary? Scary? She repeated, having great difficulty following the conversation. Then wise adult kicked in. No, sweetheart, new schools are fun. You'll get to make all kinds of new friends. It'll be great. Just wait and see. She reached over and hugged him as her own feelings swirled in a confusing jumble inside her. For the life of her, Melody couldn't decide what to wear. Everything was either too big or too awful. She'd vowed to get new clothes at some point, but that hadn't happened. She put on the white wrap shirt she'd worn that first time they went to the burger joint. There were gaps in all the wrong places. One part of her was thrilled, the other was panicking. He'd called this a date, a real date. At the time, she thought that a good sign. Now, she wasn't at all sure about that. Was he planning to tell her he was leaving? That they were leaving? The inside of her panged forward at that thought. Dylan was downstairs watching a cartoon. Melody tried to calm her rising panic at the thought of not ever seeing him again. Surely Blaine wouldn't do that to her. And yet, that was exactly what he had warned her of in 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different times. Don't tie your life to ours. We could be gone tomorrow. She was still trying to decide what it all meant when the doorbell rang. Oh no, I'm not ready for this. The small bouquet of daisies in his hand was hardly steady. It looked more like the aftershocks of an earthquake as Blaine stood on her front porch waiting. He listened, but heard nothing. Reaching up, he rang the doorbell again. His gaze traveled out to the curb where her white car sat. He hated the fact that they would have to take her car, and yet what choice did he have? Beginning to wonder where they were, he reached up again just as she swung the inside door open. Blaine? The skepticism on her face rained through the word. What? He cleared his throat and straightened. I thought you guys, He looked down. "Oh, these are for you." Holding them out to her, he let his gaze fall to the concrete steps. Carefully, he picked his gaze back up to her. "I wanted it to be a dozen roses, but they're beautiful, Blaine." She took the tiny bundle, and gazing first at it and then him, she shook her head. "Come on in." He stepped into the house where he removed his sunglasses. "Sorry, I'm a little early. I got off a little sooner than I thought I would." "Oh, that's okay," she said over her shoulder. Following her into the living room, he found Dylan sitting Indian-style next to the couch, watching some animated something on the television. His heart snagged there. Once again, he was struck by how much he wanted to be able to give Dylan this kind of life instead of the nightmare they were currently existing in. Not big, not fancy, but safe and cozy and homey. "I'll just put these in some water," Melody said, heading for the kitchen. Blaine followed her, trying not to assess her physical health too critically as he did so. First things first, he needed to establish that he had some grounds to give his opinion. Then he was determined to get her to see this wasn't good for her or for them. From the table, he watched her search the cabinets. Finally, she brought out a regular drinking glass. "We don't get too many flowers around here." She set the flowers in it and fluffed them up a little. Then she took the bouquet to the sink where she ran water in the glass. Finished, she set it on the table. "Thank you." "You're welcome." With everything in him, he wanted to kiss her, right here, right now. But once again, first things had to come first. "I guess we need to get Dylan packed up." Melody nodded and started out in front of him. The electricity was almost physically overwhelming when she passed only inches from him. He slammed his eyes closed and swallowed hard to stop her proximity from overtaking his sanity. In the living room, she moved, gathering and straightening. "Time to go, bud." "It's almost over, though, please." She was about to override the protest when Blaine stopped her. "It's okay, we're not in a big hurry." "Oh, okay." It was clear from the confused look she gave him that she wanted to ask, but she didn't. For that, he was glad. There were simply too many things that would have to be explained if they ever got started. When they headed north on the interstate, Melody wondered again where they were going. It seemed to her that if he'd had this super-secret babysitter the whole time, it was odd that he hadn't ever mentioned her. The possibilities circled in her head like aircraft at high noon over Houston International. Wanting something to fill the awkward silence, she reached over to the holder above his head on the sun visor. It took only a few seconds to choose the CD. She put it in the player, and, finally, the silence didn't seem so loud. "George Strait," Blaine said with a small smile. "Nice choice." And then he reached over and took her hand. Her heart leapt at the first touch of his fingers. They felt better than she remembered. Trying to push all the questions out of her head, she held his hand for one moment, believing and hoping that somehow it could all be all right. Worry and fear crawled up Melody's gut as Blaine made the last turn. "You didn't tell me we were going to AJ and Eve's." Unconsciously, she was pushing up and back in her seat as if trying to brace for a wreck. This wasn't at all what she had expected. "We're not," Blaine said, glancing at her. "Only Dylan is." "Only Dylan?" She glanced into the back. "He doesn't even know them. You're going to leave him with them and he doesn't even know them?" Blaine laughed softly. "Mel, relax. AJ and Eve are nice people. You'll be in good hands." Strange, if they were such good hands, then why did she feel like she was handing her firstborn to the devil? Blaine walked the two of them up to the little house. He and Eve had prepared an entire Dylan game plan for the night. What to eat, what to watch, time for bed, the whole thing. So when he climbed the steps with Melody's hand in his and Dylan at his other side, there was only one small moment of utter terror after he'd rung the doorbell. "Hi, guys." Eve appeared, looking decidedly unfashionable in an oversized t-shirt and capri jeans that had strings instead of a hem. "Come on in." She pushed the door open. Her hair was up in some kind of clip, not looking as if she had even brushed it in a month. But when Blaine stepped past her, he caught the excited smile on her face. In the living room, she guided them forward. "You can just put his stuff over there. Sorry, I'm a mess. I've been making cookies, and let's just say, they're not my forte." Blaine laughed as he put Dylan's things down. Eve went over and sat on the coffee table. "Hi, Dylan. I'm Eve. Remember me?" He barely looked up. For 1 second, Blaine panicked. Maybe Melody was right. Dylan didn't even know these people. Not really. "Dylan," Melody said, letting go of Blaine's hand to bend down to the boy. "Eve is my friend, remember? And she's Blaine's friend, too. I'm sure you're going to have lots of fun at her house tonight." Melody looked over. "There's a DVD in his backpack. It's one of his favorites." "Okay," Eve said, as though she was taking mental notes. "His pajamas are in there, too." At that moment, there was a not ignorable yipping sound accompanied almost instantly by a scratching noise on the back door. "Oh, yeah, we got another little guy. AJ brought him home from work yesterday." Eve opened the back door, and in raced a mutt the color of mud. She tried to catch him, but missed. Dylan squealed at first as the little dog jumped at him, licking and sniffing in all-out glee. Eve shut the door and came to the rescue. "His name is Buster." She picked the little dog up, lifting her chin, trying to get away from the dog's expressive ardor. "Buster, this is Dylan." "Hi, Buster." Dylan put his hand out, and Buster jumped to lick it. Instantly, Dylan jumped back and giggled. "He's a little high maintenance," Eve said, once again backing away from the dog's frantic attempts to show her how much he loved her. "Do you want to go outside and play with him? I'm sure he'd love to have somebody to run with." "Sure." The saucer-like shape of Dylan's eyes made Blaine smile. "Well, well, I thought I recognized the car," AJ said, ducking in from the kitchen. A moment, and he strode in dressed smartly in his EMT uniform. "Sorry I'm not dressed for the occasion." "We're going to babysit while they go out," Eve said, standing and clearly expecting a firestorm. "Out?" He sized up Blaine, but withheld his assessment. He looked at Melody. "You're not working tonight?" She dug her fingers into her back pocket. Not tonight. I've, mostly been babysitting this summer." Her gaze went over to Blaine's, begging for help. "Mel's been a real lifesaver this summer." He put his arm around her, and this time there was no pretending to it. He admired her, and he was falling in love with her for real. There was no point in hiding it. His gaze turned to her and said as much. "I don't know what I would have done without her." AJ's gaze registered extreme displeasure. "Babysitting? What about the store? What about school?" Melody gazed only at Blaine, and her face held a soft smile of hope. "They're not going anywhere, but I sure am enjoying my summer." There was a half a second of total awkwardness that neither Melody nor Blaine noticed. Well," Eve said, "you two better get going, or it will be time to be back." Blaine was the first to break the connection, but he could tell Melody never really did. "I guess so. I'll just tell Dylan bye." "I'll go with you," Melody said, grabbing his hand. And they did. When they were back in the car moments later, Melody had to force the air into her lungs. What was that, anyway? Did the two of them just stand in AJ's house and act like they were together? She could have sworn they did, and she could have also sworn that it hadn't been an act. "This feels weird," she whispered as they drove off. He glanced at her. "What?" "This. Being in a car with you and no Dylan. I don't think we've done this in, forever." Blaine reached across the seat and pulled her fingers into his. Forever's a long time. When he kissed them, Melody was pretty sure this wasn't an act. But she was no longer sure it wasn't a dream. "This is probably all cold," Blaine said, realizing only then that the little paper bag he'd packed the food in was not about keeping anything the right temperature. He pulled the supermarket chicken out. "I wanted it to be all nice and everything. Not sure how well that's going to work." The coleslaw was next in the little plastic container, followed by the rolls and the salad. Sitting on the blanket he'd already spread out, Melody watched him skeptically. I know you don't eat much at the burger joint, but I thought... Blaine laid it all out and pulled out the 2 paper plates and forks. Then he sat back, looking at all of his efforts, realizing how pitiful they actually were. This was really supposed to be more romantic. I had it all planned out in my head. It's fine, Blaine. Really. It's great. Something in her voice indicated that it really was, although how that was possible he wasn't sure. When did you do all of this anyway? After work. Well, actually during work. I conned Jason into covering for me. Blaine took the 2 bottles of iced tea that was by now hot out of the bag. He spun the bottle to her. Hot tea? She laughed. You're crazy. Sorry, he said, deflating on the word. This really looked so much better in my head. Again she laughed. Hey, don't worry about it. We're together. That's all that matters, right? For a moment their gazes held, then she let hers drop. I don't want more than salad anyway. Irritation surged in him. Is that all you ever eat? She shrugged. It's good for you. Not if it's all you ever eat. Although he was extremely frustrated, he reined his comments back in. This was going to be harder than he'd thought. Don't you want something else too? Chicken at least? Seeming to shrink at the question, she shook her head. He wanted to argue so bad it was killing him, but he swallowed that and handed her a plate with only salad on it. Then he loaded his own. He had to find something else to talk about while they ate, or they would both end up with indigestion. I got an A in one of my classes first summer, a C in the other, but they average out to a B. He ripped into his chicken. How'd you do? I got 2 Bs. One was high, I think. One was low. So are you still thinking about changing your major? I went in on Wednesday and got some papers. From what I can tell, I'm about 18 hours from being able to get a general, which would be great for a teaching assistant. What about teaching for real? Is that something you'd like to do? She took in a breath. I don't know if I could handle that. A whole classroom? That's a lot of responsibility. Maybe you could do some substituting in the fall, see how you like it. I hadn't thought about that. I can't take all 18 hours then anyway. Maybe I could do like 9 and 9 and do some subbing. She took a bite of salad as she considered the idea. That might work, actually. He took a bite of coleslaw just as she nailed him with her gaze. So, Dylan said something interesting today. Uh-oh. She angled another bite at her mouth. He said you were moving. So what's up with that? The bite went down the wrong path. He choked and grabbed for his tea. Yeah. Well, that was something I wanted to talk to you about. Angling another bite at her mouth, she raised her eyebrows. So, talk. He felt like he was on the witness stand. Well, things have been pretty bad for a while now, but, well, it just feels like they're getting worse. He set his still-filled plate to the side and took another drink. Mom left last weekend and didn't show back up until Wednesday. She's trashed again. His gaze left hers and slid out to the darkening sky somewhere out beyond the tall buildings and city lights. I love her, you know, but I don't know how to help her and keep Dylan safe, and it's getting to the point I think I'm going to have to choose. Did Dave show up again? Blaine shook his head. No, but she was with him. She told you that? In one of her infamous moments of full disclosure, a bug landed on his coleslaw and he flicked it away. Dylan's scared to death, and I just don't think it's fair to him to stay anymore. Melody took a drink. He's been saying that. What? Nothing big, just that he gets scared sometimes, and he's glad you're there. I think he's scared for your mom, too. He nodded. So am I, but what do you do when somebody doesn't want your help? I've tried to get her to meetings and stuff, but she just won't go. She says she can quit, but she never does. The questions drifted through him for a moment, and then he sighed. So, we're moving. I don't know when or where or how, but we can't stay there anymore. And what about your mom? The middle of him plunged off a cliff. I don't know. I really don't. They sat in silence for a long moment. Her salad was hot and not all that great, so Melody set it aside and took another drink. She let her gaze go up to the trees and into the deepening night beyond. It's nice out here. Shaking her hair back, she leaned on one elbow and just let herself relax. It's nice being here with you, he said as his gaze went only to her. That's strange. I kind of thought you didn't want to be around me anymore. Why she kept being that honest with him, she had no idea, but it was almost like she was challenging him to break up with her. After last week and all. His gaze fell. I'm sorry about that. The breath he let out was hard and guilt-ridden. I'm such a dope. You're not... He held up his hand. Let me finish. His gaze drilled into her. Mel, I'm messed up. I am. I've known that for a long time now. At first, it was because I had all the money in the world, and so I thought I was better than everyone else. Then I fell off that high horse, hard. It was like falling into a sewer and trying to figure out which direction you could go to get out of the crap. But everywhere I went, there was just more crap. I hated myself. I hated everybody else. I hated life and everything about it. It was awful. I blamed my dad and my mom and life and God. I wanted somebody to snap their fingers and put everything back the way it was. But nobody was doing that. I spent a lot of years really angry at the world for what it had done to me. I used that anger as an excuse to create this whole other life for myself. I was Blaine Donovan, ultra-rich jerk who jetted off to exotic destinations on a whim and had no problems in the world. Except it was all a total lie. It wasn't until Eve pointed out that I was trying to be two different people that I really woke up to how stupid I was being. I finally had to take a real look at my life so I could figure out what to keep and what to ditch. But as good as my intentions are, even now, I'm still me. I still mess up on a pretty regular basis. His gaze found hers, like I did with you. Blaine, no, I know I messed up, Mel. I know it. I can see it in your eyes when I can't tell you what's going on with me, when I freak because you want to make a decision that might help me out. I see how much I hurt you, but I just can't seem to stop. It's like life is swirling around me and I can't figure out what the thing is that's going to fix it for everybody. You don't have to fix it for everybody. Just do your best and be honest. The words hung between them as the breeze wafted through the park. Be honest. He took a breath, seeming to consider that. Well, okay. Letting you in scares me to death. He looked right at her, and she felt his words as much as she heard them. Being me scares me to death, too. I mean, who am I, really? Am I the guy who wears designer clothes to work, or the guy who cleans up his mother's vomit? Am I the guy who has the Lanas and the Farrons of the world wanting to go out with me? Or the guy who's so broke he can add what he has in the bank on paper without a pencil? I've tried to figure it out, but it just doesn't make any logical sense no matter how hard I try. It's like I'm living two lives, and I don't really know how to be either one. For a long moment, Melody said nothing. Then she moved to look at him ever so slightly. Do you want to know who I think you are? She waited, and when there was no answer, she continued. I think you're a really awesome guy who has more on his shoulders than anybody can possibly handle alone. You're trying to be everything to everybody, but there comes a point when that doesn't work. You have to figure out what's most important to you and be that. He laughed. Now you sound like Eve. Well, she took a breath. Maybe Eve's onto something. You know, I think this has less to do with who the world thinks you are, and more to do with who you think you are. Who are you, Blaine? Who do you want to be? He shook his head and let out a breath. I want to be the guy that stands up for what's right. I want to do it right, because that's the way it's supposed to be, and so people might think I'm worth something. Worth something? Melody shook her head. Blaine, you are worth something. Don't you see that? You're kind and gentle, and so good with Dylan it brings me to tears sometimes. I love that about you, but you act like it's something to be ashamed of, like you have to make everybody believe you are someone you're not, to be worth something, as you say. But that's what the world expects, to take charge, get in there and do it. They don't give medals for caring, you know. Well, maybe they should. Maybe they've got it all wrong. Maybe caring is more important than all the money and education and accomplishments that you can string together. Melody took a breath and looked at him with open love. You are a good person, Blaine. You are. You work yourself into the ground to make things better for your family and for everybody around you. You show up early, work late, put your all into every project you take on, and still you don't think you're doing enough. It was like she could suddenly see all the way to the middle of him. You know, I could be wrong about this, but I think you've gotten really good at being your own worst enemy. I think you need to learn to give yourself a break. That's easy for you to say. How do I let Dylan down like that? How do I not do everything I'm doing? Even she had to admit that it was hard to see the way out of needing to do everything. I don't know. Maybe you don't. But maybe it's worth taking a look at it to see if you can. The money thing. Surely there are grants for students like you. Scholarships, something. I've started the paperwork before, but it takes forever. Okay, so you let me help. Mel, I can't. See, that's what I'm talking about. Somebody offers to help, and you instantly shut them off with, I can't let you do that. I can't ask you to help. What is that, huh, Blaine? Is it pride or something else? Truthfully, Blaine had no answer for that question for a long moment. All he knew was that asking for help sent him into spasms of feeling like a total failure such that even actually failing didn't do. Because he'd been working on being truthful, he took a breath and shared what was in his heart, although it felt like dangling over a cliff with no rope. It's so hard for me to ask somebody for help. Why? This was so hard to go deep, hard to admit what he'd never even admitted to himself. Because it feels like it makes me a terrible failure, like everybody's looking at me and whispering what a failure I am. I feel like they will find out what I already know. What's that? That I'm not good enough, that I'm not smart enough or strong enough to really do it, that I'm a waste of good space. He reached down and wrapped his hands over his ankles. That's why you act like you're better than everybody? She asked softly. Because you feel worse? Although it took more than a moment, he finally nodded. I figure if I can con them into believing I'm that guy, maybe they'll believe it and never have to get to know the real me. Which is who? His gaze came up to hers. Somebody who's scared to death and wants to do the right thing, but doesn't have a clue what that is or how to do it. Aw, man. Welcome to the club. Melody shook her head and laughed softly. I feel like that every minute of my life. And that doesn't bother you? It took a moment to answer. Well, yeah, it bothers me. Sometimes it bothers me a lot. I look around at the Eves of the world and I think, what am I missing here? Why does life just fall into place for them, and it just doesn't for me, no matter how hard I try? The question sliced through Blaine like a double-edged sword. Sitting there being honest with him, Melody couldn't know the spirit-searing heartache Eve had been through in the past week. As he listened, he began to see something he'd never really noticed before. Underneath the veneer of who they presented themselves to be, there were a lot of similarities to people down deep. They all had dreams and desires. Conversely, they all had fears and guilt, things they would change, and things they would do everything in the world to get to do over. Sitting here in front of him was not Melody, a traveler who happened to cross paths with his, but a soul, a spirit with a story, a distinct but still similar story. That story shaped her, made her who she was, just as every other person had their own story. Yes, There was the outside package, but that wasn't the whole story. He thought about Eve, beautiful to a fault, and yet broken and hurting underneath. His thoughts went to AJ, and although nothing in him wanted to admit it, the truth was staring at him too hard to dismiss it. As he went person by person through those in his life, he saw their desperate attempts to hide the hurt and fear with what? Everything. Clothes, shoes, money, cars, education, position, status. And down the other spectrum, drugs, alcohol, anger, violence, selfishness. As he thought about it, he realized that it was the same disease, just with different symptoms. "Where'd you go?" Melody asked, and he felt her gaze. His gaze swept through hers. "Have you thought any more about the God thing?" It seemed so central to everything, because that piece was the one on which his life had begun to turn, and he wanted to share that with her. "Well, since we're being honest," she smiled at him. "I prayed the other day. I don't know if I did it right or anything, but I felt so bad for you that day you came in. And that morning, I prayed for you. Actually, I just kind of talked to God, but it was the first time I've ever really done that." His heart swelled toward her. "And how did it feel?" She considered the question. "Good. Peaceful. Like there really was somebody there listening." Blaine nodded. "I've been reading my Bible, and it's the weirdest thing. It always talks about something I'm going through, no matter where I open it. I'm starting to think that it isn't a coincidence." He grew quiet, and then spun and lay down on the blanket. The night had advanced in earnest, and cool air had replaced hot. The second hand ticked off several seconds before she lay down shoulder to shoulder next to him. The universe stretched above them. He had to ask the question because it was on his heart. "What would you think about going to church?" His heart dangled on the end of that question for a long moment. "With you?" she finally asked. Letting his head fall to the side, he looked at her. "Yeah, what would you think about going to church with me?" It took a breath to settle the thought. "Well, maybe I wouldn't say no." They stayed like that then, side by side, just being together until both were stiff from the chill. Then together they packed up and drove to Eve's. There was much less tension, many fewer walls between them now. Only a couple blocks from Eve's, Melody looked over at him. "Isn't it weird to be for real?" He glanced at her. "How do you mean?" "I mean, to be able to talk about something other than the weather and the latest CDs with somebody. To really be honest." He smiled full on. "Yeah, it's pretty cool." "Yes, it is." There was a softness about their new friendship as they walked up to Eve's. She came to the door before they'd even rung the bell. Even she looked different. Blaine couldn't explain it really, but it was like he was seeing the real in others rather than the facade now. "Hey," he said softly, following her into the living room as he kept careful hold of Melody's hand. "How was he?" "Wonderful," Eve said. In the living room, the sight completely stopped Blaine like a shot to the heart. On the couch lay AJ, his arm under Dylan's head, both asleep. "They were watching the game," Eve explained as she got Dylan's bag. "I'm not sure which one fell asleep first." Watching them, the older man protectively cradling the boy, the venom Blaine had felt toward AJ slowly dissipated a molecule at a time. Maybe AJ wasn't the horrible guy Blaine had made him out to be. Maybe, just like Melody with Eve, there really were things he didn't know about AJ, things that would make his animosity understandable. It was a thought Blaine was still thinking Monday afternoon when Eve walked into the break room. "Looks like talking went over well," she said, getting her water and sitting down. "You could say that." "What else could you say?" she asked, her smile coming through. "Well, I could ask if you know a good church." Her eyes shot open. "No, not like that," he said with a laugh. "Don't go marrying us off yet." "Oh, man!" She sat back and put her hand on her chest. "You scared me there for a minute." "No." We talked about it, and we want to try church, but I have no idea how to even go about that. Well, I've got a few if you want to hear them. I'm listening. This has been For Real, Book 3, The Courage Series, written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.